Friends, welcome to this session honoring the children. Just to start us off in the right way, I'm going to ask Jordan Bighorn to begin our afternoon.
Thank you, Roshan, and good afternoon all. I'm going to be sharing a song, an honor song that's in the form of a lullaby, a Lakota lullaby. And as we think about the children, which is going to be at the heart of this afternoon session, this is an acknowledgement of them. As you hear the words, they roughly translate to good-hearted boy, close your eyes, it's time to sleep. Tomorrow is going to be a better day. Tomorrow is going to be beautiful. Chante washte hokshila nagi estima ane peki washte we ayohe Chante washte hokshila nagi estima ane peki washte we Chante washte hokshila nagi estima ane peki washte we ayohe Chante washte hokshila nagi estima ane peki washte we
Thank you, Jordan. Thank you for starting us off the right way and putting our minds and hearts in the right place for this session today. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I just want to acknowledge that I'm, along with Mary Ellen, who I'll introduce briefly, are coming to you from the territory of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Saanich First Nation, on the southern tip of Vancouver Island in British Columbia, Canada. Maybe Jordan, you could tell us where you're coming from today?
Yes, I'm coming from Manitoba and Winnipeg in Treaty 1 territory, the homelands of the Métis Nation, the Ojibwe, the Cree. Further west, we have my relatives, the Dakota, and a bit north in the province, we have our OG Cree. And way up there is our Inuit relatives who come down often into Winnipeg.
Thank you. This session, which as you know is called Honoring the Children, Social Action for Truth, Reconciliation and Justice, really has grown out of some events and reports in recent months in Canada. The reports of mass graves and unmarked burials of hundreds of Indigenous children coming to the public awareness. To date, there's been 4 of these mass graves and unmarked burials reported at Kamloops here in British Columbia, the Cowessess First Nation in Saskatchewan, at the Lower Kootenay First Nation, also here in British Columbia, and Penelakut, which is not far from where Mary Ellen and I are today. These mass graves of Indigenous children are all related to the residential school system that began originally in Canada in the 1830s. And there were over 130 residential schools until the last one closed in 1996. The discovery and reporting, I think we have some technical, there has long been knowledge of children who disappeared and never came home from the residential schools. Canada had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that completed its work in 2015 that was not able, because it wasn't funded as supported to, look into the issue of mass graves and how many children died while at residential schools. They were able to evidence 3,000 cases. It is expected that in the upcoming months and years, we're going to see numbers far exceeding that. And there will be many reports, many more reports to come. Nations across the country are now doing the work of searching the grounds around residential schools, finding the evidence of the size and scope of the mass graves and unmarked burials. You know, this episode, these reports, this knowledge that has come to the forefront in Canada and globally, certainly in this country, has caused quite a reckoning, outpourings of grief, of confusion, of loss, of struggling to understand and reconceptualize the history of and taken for granted assumptions about Canada. It is the reality of a genocide being revealed that as a society and as a nation had long been denied to have ever have occurred. And while there has been, and we'll talk about it, much work done to address Canada's legacy of colonialism, much advocacy and leadership by Indigenous peoples, this episode reveals how much work remains to be done, how slow much of that work has been, how much even basic knowledge of the truth remains to be told, heard, understood, and acted upon. So, you know, this session today is to explore both what has happened and what we're now learning and what we're now understanding, and to talk about what it represents, what it means, and the types of actions that could be taken going forward. And we're very blessed and very honored. I'm very honored to have two tremendous leaders and individuals with us to help guide us through this conversation. With me here is Dr. Mary Ellen Turpel Lafond. Dr. Mary Ellen Turpel, beyond being my friend and mentor and teacher, is Canada's most prominent Indigenous public intellectual. She's a judge. She's a professor at the University of British Columbia Law School. She's the head of the Residential School History and Dialogue Center at the University of British Columbia. She is Canada's most renowned advocate and champion of the rights of children, globally renowned for her work for the well-being of children, all children and their families. And she served very public roles in that. She is a member of the Muskeg Lake Cree First Nation in Saskatchewan. And it's just truly an honor and wonderful to have her with us. And Jordan Bighorn is Lakota from the Fort Peck, Assiniboine, and Standing Rock Sioux communities. He is an activist, educator, filmmaker, working on the grassroots of social change and social action, the work of reconciliation. And I will say reconciliation is itself a contested term, and we'll probably talk about that a little bit as we move along today. and has tremendous experience to share with us about what is happening on the ground, what he sees taking place, spending years and years, especially with young people, but also more broadly in this work. So just briefly, the mechanics of this conversation. It's a live conversation. We haven't scripted or prepared. We in any formal way. It's going to be very free-flowing and very open and fluid. You're welcome to join by posting questions in the chat, in the written chat, and I see there's already a number of questions. These will be forwarded to me, and I'll be monitoring them, and we'll get through as many of them as we can. Microphones, everything will be through the written chat, so please just start posting questions whenever you wish, and we'll start addressing them. You can raise your hand, but it's not going to do much because so you might as well not raise your hand, but just write your question when you think of it. I will apologize to my two colleagues here. At times I may cut off and move and push us in other directions. We have about 90 minutes total, so we have about 75 minutes to go, and so I'll keep us moving along. So just to start us off, I would like to ask maybe Mary Ellen first, and then Jordan, to take 5 or 10 minutes and help us understand the context more of what has occurred over the last few months, what we have learned, why it's important, and maybe some of the reactions to it. And just, Mary Ellen, to you, when the first report to Kamloops came out about a month and a half ago now, you wrote an op-ed in Canada's national newspaper, main newspaper, the Globe and Mail. You described the report, quote, as unthinkable, undocumented, yet known. And I thought maybe in your remarks you might comment on why you use those words, unthinkable, undocumented, yet known. So Mary Ellen, thank you. We'll kick us off.
Thank you, Roshan, Dr. Danesh. It's wonderful to be in the virtual circle. And I also want to acknowledge and thank Jordan for the beautiful Lakota song, and to ground us. And that was really beautiful. And I'm actually sitting here with Jordan's mom. So I'm sending you lots of mom energy as well, Jordan, today. So anyway, I'm so delighted, and thank you, Roshan, for framing the discussion today. And of course, I'm very honored to be able to participate in the discussion. When the news became globally known about the situation of a mass grave at Kamloops after the May long weekend, and I use the term mass graves advisedly, anytime there is a grave that's located and it's connected to a place or a site where the human rights of individuals were not respected, we use the term in international law, mass grave. And you will see that there are some protocols for the terminology, the Bournemouth Protocol developed by the International Commission on Missing Persons. So from a lot of the language I'm going to bring to the topic will reflect a human rights lens, because it isn't simply like a condo developer, preparing ground to make a condo and finds remains that may be considered historic, if you like. We've experienced that a lot as tribal people. What this was finding the graves of children using technology, ground penetrating radar, and a 20-year project by Kamloops on behalf of the 39 nations from which children were taken and forced to attend that school in the interior of BC. And in part searching for that mass grave based on the oral testimonies of the survivors who said, I went out in the middle of the night and was forced to dig a grave in which my classmate was buried and never seen again. So this is something that for our people, not only at Kamloops, but in many locations, have been carrying these stories for a long time. And in terms of the experiences of children, so when you're a child forced to attend an institution like a residential school, again, some of the discourse in Canada talks about it like it's a school. It wasn't a school. And, my children, we talk about this in my family, I have 4 children, their great-grandparents were student 001, the first student, and 002, the second student, to walk through the residential school at Duck Lake, Saskatchewan, the St. Michael's Indian Residential School, which was also run by the Oblates, the Catholic Church. And they were excited to go to the school in part because their parents were involved in building it, and they were told it was going to be some sort of great thing. And that was grotesque misrepresentation. It was a project where they even took land from the reservations and built in a number of places these schools, and then they became what, of course, they were intended to be from the beginning, which were institutions and processes to completely dehumanize children and to totally disrupt family structures, culture, stop the transmission of First Nations culture and language from parent to child, from grandparent to grandchild, and to disrupt the entire stability of families, disrupt communities. And at the same time, like if we use Kamloops as an example, in total, there were about 150,000 children in Canada that were forced to attend these schools. And when I say forced, it was a matter of law, and parents were put in jail. Children were taken with the RCMP and the Indian agent, and it was by force. They were rounded up, even if they had to come by boat and collect the children from coastal regions of, say, the Pacific Northwest, the prairies, northern areas of the prairies. And the various denominations of churches ran these schools on behalf of Canada, as Roshan said, for more than 100 years. So they were paid by Canada. It was a Canadian law. And it was a Canadian law that you would suffer severe punishment if you didn't allow your child to go to those schools. That law was on the books until just very, very recently, like within the last 10 years. And the law that brought that into effect remains on the books with many, many issues and stain of discrimination. So from a personal viewpoint, when we think about Kamloops, and so when Roshan said, it wasn't unknown, but the survivors were never believed. And when you're not believed, you've lived through what can only be called a genocide. And I don't say that lightly. I don't call it a cultural genocide either. It certainly meets the definition of genocide, the forceful removal of children from one culture to another. The goal was to remove the children, to take the identity away from the children so they could be Christianized and could participate in the project of settlement. And that also meant that they would no longer be rights holders in their own community, in their own systems, and therefore the land and all of the other aspects of the indigeneity connected with the land could be erased. So it was a complete project, but like anything, the most effective genocides throughout history target children, generally children and women, but children. So the destabilizing impact that residential schools had is something that's coming to public attention now. So it was not unknown to us. But what we have walked a path on for people of my generation, and younger generation is seeing this now, is that the mistreatment of the survivors, when they sought to hold someone accountable for residential schools, it was a 40-year fight to hold someone accountable. And the complexity of that fight, the courage of those survivors, many of them brought lawsuits against people who terrorized them physically, sexually, emotionally. The abuse was horrific. They took lawsuits finally, most of them starting in the 1970s or 80s. And they were horrifically cross-examined, denied, rejected, and even shamed inside our own First Nations community, where talking about sexual abuse was something that made you look bad. So if you were a victim, you were shamed and ridiculed. And the church and the Indian agents and others continued to advance that sort of culture of shame, culture of not opening up. Because if you talked about being sexually, physically abused at residential schools, it was because you were deserving it. So this whole psychological terror that generations have lived with in terms of the residential school issues. But we've always known, as this has gone forward, that there were tens of thousands of children that went to school and never came back. Now, we were always given these crazy reasons, and we've never had access to records and processes. We were always given these reasons like, well, they ran away. And we did have a massive diaspora in our First Nations after residential school. Many of our relatives, you know, speaking myself from a prairie viewpoint, many people never went home after residential school. They did move to Western Canada or Eastern Canada or any other place they could possibly move because the horror of what they'd been through was so severe and they had no way to process it. So we had a massive diaspora. We also had, after the residential schools, when the residential schools started to be shuttered, many of them were opened or repurposed as orphanages. And we then went very hard into the child welfare system, then removing children, saying we're bad parents because we're in such terrible shape when we came out of the residential schools. So our grandparents' generation was really hit hard. Many of those children were removed. So when I say diaspora, it really was another key element of what you look and see in a genocide, which is not just the horrific treatment, but then the diaspora, and then the complete community dissembling. So the important point to talk about, and just to frame for me is a lot of this is about being heard and being believed. Creating space for what is not necessarily comfortable, which in Canada, it has really been hard for those survivors to be heard. Even today, it's hard for us to be heard. And you will see, we're not trying to pick on the Catholic Church, for instance, but the Catholic Church ran 70% of the schools. And the Catholic Church found a way out of the class action settlement so that it wouldn't have to pay its compensation. And it had a handmaiden in the government to agree with them. Very powerful, capable people in the legal profession were able to manipulate that profession and that system so that they wouldn't have any financial responsibility while survivors suffer. And this is one of the things that's very significant to us today is it's active that as First Nations, our people are investigating genocide. Unfortunately, it's an international and humanitarian issue, and we need Canadians and people of faith, and we need the global community who's become more aware of it to understand that this has to be taken very seriously and addressed properly. And those who used all of this sort of trickery or what have you to escape the truth or to harm people or to minimize and deny, we will stand up very strongly against those people now. And we will identify them and we will say, you have denied this and minimized it. And this can't be appropriate, because that's what it requires for us to honor the children today, is to speak and create space for survivors, including cultural safety for survivors to be heard. The final thought I would say, and of course, Jordan will add much more to this, a lot of questions, is one of the things that's been really challenging for us as First Nations in the last decades is as the residential school issues came out, the enormity of the abuse was seen and validated. Governments and others really turned to the issue of, well, you people need healing. Like, you know, okay, you guys just need to go heal yourself because you're really messed up. And we very quickly went from trying to bring out the truth, and people forced us to something called reconciliation prematurely. And we were not ready, and we never wanted this reconciliation. We wanted justice, because real reconciliation doesn't happen without justice. And justice means being believed, being heard, dealing with the harm. So we skip steps in Canada. So where we are now is this space where we have to go back and we have to unpackage it and we have to get it right. So I'm really happy to be here to talk about this work, and also, of course, very interested in responding to questions you might have. Thank you, Roshan.
Thank you so much, Mary Ellen. And just before I turn to Jordan, just foreshadowing some of the themes you touched on that I think we'll dive into more. Obviously, you spoke about not being believed, which also connects to larger issues of voice and representation and place within society and space, as you said, for affirmation of those voices and the leadership to understand and hear those experiences and believe them. You also, of course, talked a lot about the role of the Catholic Church. I think it raises a broader question about what's the role that religious organizations or institutions can or should not play in this kind of work, and how that should be done. Also, you know, I guess something on my mind is what happens to a society when its foundational stories are revealed to be myths. And I think that is a lot of what is happening in Canada right now and in the United States around issues of race as well. And what is a response to that? Because it can become very divisive very quickly. And what kind of leadership and action is needed on that. And then finally, we will return to this question of reconciliation and what it really means, and the relationship between unity, justice, truth, and those connections. So I just going to keep foreshadowing themes that we'll head to as we move along. So thank you for that. And Jordan, we look forward to your enlightening us now as well.
Oh boy, I hope I can maybe bring a little bit of a cell phone light as opposed to enlightenment. That was a wonderful opening, Dr. Turpel Lafond. I could have listened a lot more and learned, and especially in recognition of, I think, what I hope to contribute in and I guess being a little bit closer to a representative of a younger generation, the youngest generations. Because from my vantage point, and I'm so happy, as you mentioned, that the 40 years of work that maybe even the most recent generations would acknowledge, former National Chief Phil Fontaine and others that would have been somewhat of the face of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission as it came into being, but so many others beforehand that even after Native peoples could even legally bring a lawsuit, that things were happening at that point on our behalf, on my behalf, before I was born. And that's, of course, a nod to Mom there in the background of my being able to be here and share with you all and enjoy the life that I have is an element of survival, and an element of, clearly, when you're able to have an intact family and a relationship and not be taken from your mother's arms the moment you're born because someone made a call to CFS, as was mentioned earlier, that just a different type of system of family deprivation. That my life was set on a certain course that I could appreciate and perhaps take for granted, things that now I need to pay more attention to, given what seems to be being further eroded away on a life and death scale. So that's just kind of some initial reactions at this point. There's so much to say here, folks, but where I'm coming from here in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and an opportunity to work with First Nations youth for the better part of my career. I'm an American as well, American Indian, as they say. So there are subtleties. I saw a question come through the chat, subtleties and differences between the two national communities. But again, from my point of view as a Lakota person, there is no border. This is, we'll call it North America or Turtle Island, but we are all tribal people on this continent. But as history has shown, things turned out quite differently. So I've had a bit of a benefit of growing up in the States and having connection there and understanding how things turned out, some of the benefits and drawbacks. and then moving to Canada in the 90s, and then finally here to Winnipeg in the early 2000s, working directly with what might be called a modern day boarding school. I don't want to draw a direct comparison to the residential schools, but when you still have an institution where young people have to leave home, come into surrounded by suburban neighborhoods, and have to, fight through still a Western Canadian curriculum, there are still too many reflections that remind us of what the design of these systems are meant to do, which is ultimately produce a tax-paying Canadian citizen that may not bring to the fore some of these rights and histories that need to be righted. So traveling to northern communities, understanding the topography, the geography, the flying in and boating into a community. There's no Tim Hortons there, but the same treasured values of generosity, of laughter, of tradition, equal with as much as the church itself in many communities has taken a particular hold. It has provided some things for community, so it is very present in some places. But underneath it all, I think the value of community, of relationship and family shines through no matter what community may have as its front-facing interface of being a spiritual people, a hardworking people, a sacrificial people, and one that perhaps is holding true to values that indeed both countries that we live in are trying to espouse internationally. We take care of one another, we welcome everybody in, this is democracy. And the irony that so much around us, at least in Canada, is all this Indigenous language of our names, of our cities, of our rivers, etc., and yet this incongruency of how we're coming to terms with how this country was built is interesting. So the one from the standpoint of the younger generation, just so far as what I've witnessed and worked with here in Winnipeg, this background behind me is the building we work in, and it's an after-school tutoring program in the north end of Winnipeg, which brings with it what you might say is a lot of the stereotype of a community that has different social and economic challenges. But when you live and work here, you quickly, those things recede, and it's only media headlines that'll bring those negative things to the fore. But when you're here, you just see the smiles and the waves and the screams sometimes on the sidewalk, but it is a vibrant community. In that, young people that are finding their way, that are coming to terms with being still first-time graduates in their families, secondary or post-secondary, that are reuniting families. Again, coming out of CFS care, Manitoba has one of the highest, if not the highest, count of children in care that are First Nations background. That are still traveling actively to their northern homes and communities. A lot of political and action, social action happening, where on Canada Day, I think it was quite the headline where a couple of statues were pulled down here in Canada, or here in Winnipeg, of former queen and the current queen. So, and quite historically, the Forks, a meeting place of many cultures, the birthplace of a new culture, the Métis Nation, and having some geography of being quite at the crux and the center, not only of Canada, but perhaps in North America, and a lot of history, traditional history of sacred sites that can be drawn out from Manitoba here out across Turtle Island. So quite a special place, but for young people who are witnessing many of these events unfold around them, I have just found that opportunities like this, opportunities to connect and learn from those who have been at the forefront of the fight, whether it's in research or on the streets or in the communities or in Ottawa or elsewhere, young people's voice are becoming now far more recognizable, far more prominent, if not for the fact that you could flip on a cell phone, record something, and it could start something that could impact the planet, such as that young woman in Michigan with George Floyd's case a year ago, just a cell phone video. And then that same thing happened here, of course, with the toppling of the statues. So I'm going to have to reflect a little bit more and bring some more thoughts as we continue this, because there's, I think one of the main themes that I'm seeing is the world has come to this part, come to Turtle Island. They've come to our house. We're one of the few, if not only, cardinal races that has not left this continent, that we haven't sought asylum somewhere else in the world. In fact, I don't know, it'd be interesting to know how many Native peoples actively travel for vacation internationally, as opposed to recognizing the beauty and the sacredness and the connection of being home, of being here. Whereas the entire planet has somehow recognized that this place, there's something about this place that they came to. And I think there's a reason for that. And maybe we'll return to that when we come to the theme of reconciliation. So young people these days are always going to be the most to suffer first, of course, when we talk about children. But the discovery, well, the rediscovery, shall we say, the physical remains of these beautiful children, I think presents a new type of spirit in the air, where during the TRC's national ceremonies and the collection of that voice, that active and living and burdened voice that our elders carried and survived with and enshrined in a certain way, I have even seen them turn that energy now, and there's a type of fire of justice and fight that their peers, indeed their relatives, perhaps their friends, have been discovered, and now their voices are ringing true. There was a video of Rosebud in the US where there was remains of children brought home from the Carlisle Indian School in the States, and the type of honoring that took place, the line of cars behind just these 8 small caskets, and the sacredness and the humility that was shown in those video clips was just so striking. And you can see even in that symbolism of being able to honor loved ones, this is all coming in a different way. It's very much anticipating it, and it could release further efforts for young people to find that connection to their history, which, to point of fact, has been buried and unmarked. So I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jordan. And just drawing out some of the themes that jumped out at me as you were speaking. One, which we hadn't noted earlier, of course, you spoke about the issue of symbols and symbolism and struggle and contestation over that, which of course is on both sides of the so-called border, as you described it, on numerous issues. But also what comes to mind when you speak to that, of course, is the concern that as has happened sometimes in the past, the response to, as you said, this foregrounding and energy and understanding that's building may also be more symbolic than substantive. And, we can lower flags to half-mast and kneel down in yards, in graveyards, but the issue of action, and I know I've been monitoring the questions, right? The underlying almost all of the questions is what is the real action that needs to be taken? And that, of course, is where the energy and focus needs to lie. So we'll want to certainly talk at some length about what individuals and communities can be doing. But you also, I think, spent a significant time on the important issue of intergenerational trauma and intergenerational impacts. And of course, Mary Ellen did as well in speaking about them, just vitally important to speak to that. Even over the last week, a story recounted to me of a young Indigenous girl who died up north, but the cause of her death, even though she's 9 years old or 10 years old, directly can be traced to effects of the residential schools, including illness and syndrome and so forth that were passed down that led to her tragic passing. And this is a common reality, this intergenerational trauma that exists and the impacts that carry on. And as you spoke to both of you, to the child welfare system and how it's often referred to as reproducing the effects and impacts of the residential schools all over again, carrying forward that legacy of colonialism. The questions, and so we have many directions to go in, but just given that the group gathered here today is both in Canada and the United States, and we have two experts here in both Canada and the United States. For those of you who don't know, Mary Ellen spent much of her life studying, doing her PhD at Harvard Law School, and also working on behalf of Indigenous peoples across the US, including winning many of the foundational Supreme Court cases down there that set many of the legal barometers. So there were a number of questions about the distinctions or not between Canada and the United States. So I think we should briefly just touch on that, and specifically was asked, is there an expectation or a history that is similar around mass graves, unmarked burial, unmarked graves related to the Indigenous residential schools in the United States? And is there an expectation that you know of similar history? And then more broadly, a broader question was asked, which I think is an important one, which is, why does it seem that justice and human rights of Indigenous peoples, at least at the moment, is so much more foregrounded in Canada than it is in the United States? And I assume there's historical and contemporary reasons for that. So I don't know, Mary Ellen, do you want to say a few words on distinctions or similarities around these issues, and then Jordan as well?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. I think the thing is that it's a shared experience of a colonial policy that seeks to eliminate Indigenous peoples, right? So there is a shared, whether that's Canada or the US, there was the settler colonialism and the shared process. The US they call them boarding schools, as opposed to we call them residential schools. The arc was a bit different. There were things that happened in the US, as Jordan and others can speak more fluently about, because his family was quite intimately involved in these issues of forced relocations. And in Canada, we've had forced relocations, not to the same extent, but we have. So in the Arctic, the Inuit, there's been a lot of relocations, forced amalgamations where different tribes were forced together and then their lands were taken. And of course, all of the tribal lands being reduced to these really small Indian Act reserves. So in Canada, we have a higher number per capita, if you like, of Indigenous people. In the US, the number of tribal peoples is smaller in comparison to the entire US population, but the issues are the same. And the colonial mindset that justified, taking land, forcing children to become Christianized, attend boarding schools, these are common systems. They're not different across a border. And it's a common set of views around highly entitled and really wanting to sort of decimate and eliminate people. And if you don't snub people out directly, this is the thing about genocide. Genocide doesn't require you to have a campaign of homicide against people. You can snub people out by exterminating their culture, their identity, removing their land, and making the continuation of their identity, culture, and connection to what is sacred to them, their land and their own relations, impossible. Now, this is a very shared experience. The thing I would say, and I love what Jordan said about the ceremonies from the repatriation of the children from the Carlisle Indian boarding school back to their tribal communities. Because at Carlisle boarding school in the US, there were kids from all kinds of different tribal backgrounds. And some of those children are now being repatriated, being brought back, because not only were children placed into graves at the residential schools, as we see into Kamloops, but the circumstances around their death. Well, we know there was this horrific policy. Why does an 8-year-old die and get put into an unmarked grave? They die because they've, at the hands of violence of someone, lots of, for instance, suffocation deaths, which are very consistent with severe sexual abuse and suffocation. There are deaths caused by incredible illnesses that happen only because people are being put together and not getting medical care and not getting attended to. Even in my family, we have a relative who was going to the TB hospital from the residential school. She was very, very sick. On the way to the TB hospital, she died. They buried her at the roadside. They didn't even take her. They just buried her at the side of the road. We've never been able to find her grave, but that's the story we have, is she died on it's just buried right there. Nobody came back. So the indignity in death of not having your culture, not having your people, and then not returning to your people. So what Jordan talks about, the kind of joy and beauty of it, it's like it's hard for people to understand why we're so incredibly happy about something that's so terrible, right? But this is what people don't understand, is the humanity of completing a process. In life, we do have to deal with darkness. We do have injustices. We do have losses, but it's how we are able to culturally and together in our human ways to give that space and respect and not to rob that from someone. So the process of repatriating the children, finding all of the mass burials, we may be exhuming and identifying those children. It's a horrific path ahead for us. In the US, they've already done it at Carlisle. And it was really beautiful for us in Canada to see that. They have a kind of tribal sovereignty in the US that's stronger than what we have in Canada. And because of their tribal sovereignty, no one will mess with the tribes. And no one said, you can't do this or that. Here, we're going to face different problems. We have other impediments. They're going to say, you can't dig this up. You can't do that. You have to have this and that. Like, we don't have the same tribal sovereignty in Canada that the US tribes fought hard to get protected. We are fighting for that. But you have to recognize in Canada how much we've had to fight the war on every front. And it's really challenging. And the damage that's caused by something like putting this into a child, this kind of like just self-loathing and hatred towards your culture, your people, to grow up without unconditional love, to be physically and sexually abused, to break all your trust, and then to go your way in the world. So survivors, they talk about, well, I'm still living with trauma. No kidding, you're still living with trauma. And they weren't even able to talk about their trauma. So now they're talking about it, and people will often say, oh, like, we can't talk to survivors. It's too difficult. Survivors call me every day and say, Mary Ellen, the bodies are here. Get over here. Let's dig them up, right? I mean, they're not in trauma. They're only in trauma because not having ceremony, not having solidarity, not being believed. And all of these issues can be addressed. I mean, we've had situations in Guatemala and elsewhere where there have been missing mass graves, missing persons. Every single person has been located and identified, sadly deceased because of political violence, for example, but every person has been identified and returned. So, I mean, in Canada, it's interesting. I just hold this, and I appreciate Roshan raising this issue about the interest in contrasts as we cross this international so-called border. I think in Canada, there's almost like a skepticism, like, well, we can't do it, like, get over it, right? Well, what do you mean we can't do it? We're going to do it. We will not stop until we identify every child that didn't come home. Who are they? Who are their people? And how will they go back to their people? It's as much of a spiritual journey as it is using science and ground penetrating radar and DNA and all of the other things we'll do. When the churches wouldn't give us their records to make it possible, and as you know, we're stonewalled severely with them, and I butt heads with them for 40 years, they won't give us their material. They refuse to give us their material. Well, science can step in, and we will get their material eventually. They would be wise to be more forthcoming, but we also we definitely need to respect the pace that people have to address these issues, but also understand that in Canada, well, this became known as we see the process in the US, and we're working together in tribal ways. And so our new national chief, Roseanne Archibald, I have no doubt she'll be reaching out officially. We'll have delegations where we will engage with our equivalent national organization, the US, the NCAI, and other tribes directly. We'll have direct tribal links and contacts. to find out how did that work? Did that work effectively? And we will develop teams, like we will perhaps develop globally talented teams of people who will be able to do identification and repatriation and do it in a culturally informed way, guided by First Nations culture and values, not just by an international consortium of, DNA specialists. It will be grounded in our culture and values as well. We're not against science. Like, we're not some prehistoric people that, we have anthropologists, we have archaeologists, we have lawyers, we have our parents' generation went to residential school and got like an equivalent to grade 4 education. Then some of us leaped ahead. We ended up at Harvard and other places because our parents never got educated. And certainly when I think about my parents, grandparents, what they could have done, they should have been highly educated in the society, and but they were held back. So education is very significant to our people. Education that allows people to be who they want to be and be supported. So one of the biggest responses you can have to the residential school issues is to do what Jordan is doing, which is supporting young people's education, right? Like making the world open to them to make choices to be the people that they want to be without having to deny and give up the path that their parents or grandparents may have walked, and not be ashamed and not to be in the shadows about it, because shame is something that has robbed opportunity from us. So these are really big things. We walk with a lot of issues around releasing people from shame. And the best way to release people from shame is to believe them, to support them, and to work with their children and grandchildren. And when they see that, they'll be like, okay, this is not what we've endured, right?
Great. I want to jump off something that you said, but Jordan, first, to continue, I mean, you touched on it, but this issue of the United States and Canada and the experiences on both sides.
Thanks for that. Yeah, no, great. Everything is going to build, and I think that's such one of the things of you talk about the democracy and the Iroquois and how it led to the foundations of these countries. Of this is how conversation and consultation works. We listen, we build on it, we agree with it. There is no official point of opposition within our cultures. If there anything, there's an official position of alignment. How do you ensure there's alignment, particularly with the land around you and nature? So I just would like to draw on another a prolific legal scholar that's a relative of ours, was Vine Deloria Jr. And he was such a firebrand in ways and got right and spoke right to people, didn't hold anything back in a sense. But what I think, for what I gained from him in that regard, particularly from a historical narrative, both spiritually, and politically, and nationally, was going all the way back to as leaders of both Canada and the US have stated time and again that this is a Judeo-Christian part of the world as far as new countries are concerned. And going further behind that was a millennia of teaching and instruction of disconnection from Creator, disconnection from land. So not only did you get your God mad at you, but then you were thrown off the land. And it's, since then, everyone's been trying to get back. They came here and called this the new world, paradise. A lot of historical record, it sneaks through sometimes enough to show that the recognition of communities here that were living in paradise. There are a lot of the social issues in the old world were non-existent here. In fact, it was very troubling to figure out how people actually functioned without needing to kill their brother at one point, to get something across. So this subtle, I would just use a very, maybe again, youthful media type of reference to say that Canada has been represented by a queen at the forefront, which I do find to be, from what women provide, a more of a softer a gentler way that our country has unfolded here, and only by the fact that, in contrast to the US, who I would say had a more of a John Wayne situation of a militaristic, violent, and a very strong-armed way of making things happen. So there's kind of a contrast here. Because, as Dr. Turpel Lafond said, yes, there's tribal judges, there's tribal police. When I go to my community in Montana, there's a very different sense of sovereignty and empowerment. And yeah, I feel quite strong there in a sense, despite surrounded by similar issues of poverty and different social challenges. However, I think the last time that, other than most recently with Secretary Deb Haaland, who was elected there, the last time perhaps Native peoples were at the forefront were in the 70s with the American Indian movement and the occupation of Wounded Knee. In Canada, we have a national news broadcaster, and it seems every day you can find media, national stories, local, elsewhere, provincial, that have an Indigenous theme to them. So voice and presence, granted, we're 1/10 of the size of the population in the States, but you can at least be so fully reflected in this country versus in the States, it'll be bits and pieces. Although, and I guess, and kind of cruel irony is we're getting further now there's no Washington Redskins or Cleveland Indians. So now we're really, not being visible in the States, but that's positive change though. So just this theme of where Vine Deloria was sharing that, it's interesting even in some of the legalities around land and land transfer of how deep into the soil you can go and what you can actually own. He talked about how elders at the time saying, if you want to get to the land, you have to go 3 feet down because that top 3 feet is the dust of our ancestors. And so when we talk about engaging with the land, we're engaging quite literally, figuratively, and in real time with our ancestors. And so the type of care and the type of resource development, if you will, is all in direct relationship with that connection with history. And so, as was mentioned earlier, with the systems that come in to quite frankly destroy that, disrupt that, and then mechanize it, there is a type of disruption here that is even in I agree with the attitude of now it's time to heal and to reconcile. It's a very mechanical type of healing and a mechanical type of reconciliation. So we can't even get back to relating with the land and our ancestry as we once did. Most naturally, it was inherent. There was no thought process. It was a way of being. So again, watching the sage even that they lined up around those little grave sites in Rosebud, it was so much imagery there that immediately connected me to what was happening there, and I didn't need words at that point. It was an experience. So I really appreciate that point that was made earlier. That in this country there could be some conservationalists. There could be a big human rights case to say, well, this is out of protection for the remains of the children and such, so that we have to deal with that. Whereas in the States, yes, they just got it done. My family, I had just a quick story. I had an interesting upbringing as regards to Indigenous boarding schools in Chemawa Indian School in Oregon. And I always think of this, but hold it sacred in terms of something to always guide me and to remind me is I grew up going to this school where my parents worked, and there was think of the American typical weekend football game. Chemawa Indians, and these were actually real Indian kids from all over North America attending there, winning a football game, and the popcorn and the pop and the playing on the side, running around. I just had as a child, no context of history at that point, or even the history of that school. It was a beautiful campus. It's like I had this moment of what it could be to have a type of equality, until one day I go to my mom's office, who served as a counselor there, and come around a corner in the evenings. We were going to her office, and a young man was there, handcuffed, rolling in his vomit, crying out, "Help me out, help me out." And it wasn't until later on that I understood and learned and was taught, just the underlying issues of many of those students there were coming from direct results of residential schools with alcoholism, with violence and abuse. The school was as much of a safe haven as it was also a concentration of these issues for many young people. And this person had gone out, and that's the only way that they could deal with it at that time. But I'll never forget that image juxtaposed with this beautiful campus. So now, as I read most recently, thanks to these efforts, that they will be, I think, looking into the Chemawa Indian campus as to an old school building where there may yet be remains there. So things are moving along.
Thanks, Jordan, for that. And I want to sort of take the conversation in a direction that I think will fuse many of the comments and questions that have come forward and many of the comments you have made. And maybe I'll just share briefly about my own experience, my own pattern of thought over the last few decades. When I first got involved in working with and for and trying to support Indigenous peoples and some of their advocacy, being naive and somewhat superficial as I remain, was very attracted to what I saw as a easy relationship between terminology and processes of social change when we talk about things like reconciliation and ideals I was raised with as a Baha'i, and this focus on and conceptions of unity, and unity being the foundational element of existence, both within ourselves and within humanity as a whole. And as I really began to immerse myself first in the North with living in Iqaluit and then more generally across country, and that work forcing me to re-explore my own understandings that I've been raised with of Baha'i conceptions. I, of course, was forced to not just recite and read over statements in Baha'i writings, but actually to reflect much more deeply on what they would mean in the real lives of people. And one of them, of course, which is very simple and very famous in terms of the Baha'i writings, is that the purpose of justice is the appearance of unity, that justice is the prerequisite to unity. And there is a tendency, and you touched on it, Mary Ellen, to you talked a bit about, people who say this is all in the past. Can't we just get on with it? Can't we all just get along, right? This appeal to harmony in conditions of injustice is really just the veiling over of systems of oppression all over again. And the hard work, the real work of building unity is not hanging out and getting along with each other and being understanding. It involves sacrifice. It involves structural, systemic, individual, collective, societal change. It requires change that, if it is not painful, if it is not reshaping the patterns of relations, the patterns of how one lives their life and the choices they make, the surroundings that they're in and how they're spread amongst others. The issue of land has come up. I mean, we could talk endlessly about how all of this interrelates to the issue of land and land rights and nationhood and so forth. That without those shifts of justice, unity is a illusory, fictitious concept. And we can easily fool ourselves into it. I often think about in the Baha'i writings, and I think this conference is about the writings of an example of one of the Baha'i leaders, Abdul Baha, when he would write about the issues of tensions between peoples and the need for just relations. At one point, he talks about how every nation's, and using that term broadly, like general, I'm not talking just about countries, but the relationship between land. He talks about the borders, the territory of each of them needs to be completely defined and known before you could take any step towards global harmony and peace. And if that's not done, it won't happen. He was writing that in the 19th century. You're saying it today.
Exactly.
And Jordan was just saying it today. It is the same phenomenon reality. That's the element of justice. There is no reconciliation without that recognition, that fulfillment, that upholding, that just relation and just patterns at the levels of government structures and attitudes, ideas, and values, as Jordan has been talking about. All of that is a long introduction into, I think, two topics that will probably take us through our next 20 minutes, which is this term reconciliation. It's contested. I see questions about those who've rejected the term and speak of resurgent and indigenous sovereignty and nationhood in a much stronger term. And I see questions about what can be done to really, what kind of actions can be done as individuals and collectively and as religious communities to actually drive the needed change forward. And so I sort of, that's fusing about 3 or 4 sets of questions and some of my own experience. But so maybe to each of you on those big, serious issues about what we are really trying to accomplish, what really does honor the children, what kind of action is actually what is needed, and how do we understand that as individuals and groups?
Yeah, I think that I think the turn to a more profound understanding of what is reconciliation. Personally, I don't reject reconciliation. I just have had no experience of it. So the ability, like you say, Roshan, from a much deeper, more profound meeting, where's the unity? So justice has to produce unity. We still have just had this like truth piece of exploring it. And unfortunately, what are, at least again, I don't want to be jaded or cynical, but much of what I see in my own work, like, you know, as a lawyer, as a judge, like managing a lot of these very significant moments and opportunities for reconciliation, is it's just another sort of power play, right? It's like, let's create a little old boys network. Let's just get this over with and go forward, right? Okay, like, let's just bury this again, like get over it. So that is the problem, is that reconciliation has been structured as we're actually never being heard. And so one of the things, and I love when Jordan mentioned his relative Vine Deloria, you know, who himself went to a school of theology, like he went right into the heart of darkness as one of our most wise tribal people and wrote like God is red, you know, and it's like, it blew people up, right? It's like, how dare you? And it was like sacrilege. But what he said, you know, Vine Deloria said was, you know, when they came, you know, we had the land, they had the Bibles. Somehow they had the land and we had the Bibles. What happened? And so we went through that. And so lots of reconciliation feels like that trickery to me, like something's happening transactionally here, which is your idea of how we're going to all move forward with your power group. And we never come to the deeper spiritual discussion of, again, with Indigenous people, my experience is because so much space has been taken by these incredibly oppressive policies, so much trauma and harm has been caused, there's never the time to actually talk. Like, why are we so passionately committed? You know, behind where Roshan and I are here today, there's a piece of Haida art, which is a carving. It's a whorl, and it's an orca. And I was given it, and I have it because I live, we're literally very near the Pacific Northwest here. There's 79 resident orcas that live in the water just beside me, which I go kind of like monitor them if you like. There's only 79, like one's very sick. Like, why are we obsessed about these things, right? Because at a much more spiritual level, it's the idea of having that space, that coexistence. Why do we defend the old growth forest? Why do we have this more sort of profound commitment to humanity surviving in a different way than one that is transactional and exploitative? It's about honoring and stepping back. So reconciliation isn't an impossible thing. It's just the way it's used has skipped over that justice and that unity. We have no unity. I have no idea what the values, or I have an idea what the values are. It's like, I want to get rich. How much is it going to cost me to pay you off and get rid of you, and you go back and whatever, and then we'll go, like, this is what I always see when I'm like, whoa, we don't want that. Justice and truth are really deeply meaningful. And we have been in this very dark period. I don't like the word dark because sometimes it's like projecting on Indigenous people that we're bad people, but we've been in this period of time of darkness where we've never had the time and the commitment to actually have people come and say, we want to meet your knowledge keepers. We want to hear how you see things. We want to engage with you. So, or people will say things, well, will you ever speak your languages? Yeah, of course we'll speak our languages, we do. And people maintained. And I just wanted to say that as we've gone through this COVID period, it's almost like people are more open-minded, because I know for us, like I'm Cree or Nahio, so we have sweat lodges and sun dances. Those are our things. We had to cancel all of our sweat lodges. They're still canceled now, okay? So it's like making us crazy, right? Because all we talk about is like, how will we survive having to cancel one of our main ceremonies? But then we actually draw back to our strength, which is to say, well, we survived residential schools where they were all taken, or we survived like potlatches and people burning villages, and values endure because you have to transmit them and you keep them. So when we come back post-COVID to the sweat lodges, I'm confident they'll be there. Our culture's not going to disappear. Our practices, we have been weakened because we haven't had them, but that has been a really good opportunity for reflection. So in this time of loss of our practices, we've had to really go more to be able to sit with our discomfort. And as we sit with our discomfort, as we deal with these very heavy issues, we realize at a deeper spiritual level the strength that we actually have to go forward. But it isn't going to be the strength of people being alone. We've had enough time being alone. It's going to be the strength of finding that sort of more piece of unity. So I do strongly believe reconciliation is possible. It's just, we haven't even come through, we haven't entered the tunnel that we have to travel through to get to the reconciliation period. And it's been so transactional. So I'm not sure where this will lead with the discoveries of the mass graves, but it's a moment and an opportunity, perhaps also coupled with this COVID period where we've been forced to sit with discomfort, to try and reconnect and to do a kind of different, creating a bit more space in this paradigm that's been imposed on us to peel it back, right? So I don't want to be overly idealistic, but I don't throw out reconciliation. I love resurgence. I think people should express themselves and there shouldn't be a single view. But I do hold out for reconciliation because I do think it's based on unity and it's based on finding that position together.
So yeah, just before it's going to Jordan, I mean, it's transactional. It's primarily materialistic driven. It has largely to date been about appeasing the goals and objectives that governments and
or churches
predominants may have and may have to deal with. And like anything in life, if it's to be reconceptualized as a truly, and you use the term, spiritual process, then it is by its very nature innately uncomfortable, disruptive, just like any process of change in life internally and collectively is. And if it is not disruptive, if it's not doesn't come with agony and suffering, especially, and the burden of carrying that suffering is not as much on Indigenous people, but is on society as a whole having to change and be responsive to it, then it's not really taking place. And this is, I think at the heart of the, I mean, you and I know what happens behind closed doors, the way governments actually talk. Mm-hmm. And what they actually care about versus what they say publicly when engaging and working. I mean, there's a long way to go.
And I think, I mean, I don't want to take I want to hear Jordan, but I just wanted to say that that's one of the reasons why, and I'd be interested Agorist to see what Jordan thinks about this, or maybe his mom, is that's why when suddenly people I've worked with all the time, right, for years say, oh, I'm really sorry about those mass graves. And you're like, what the heck are you talking about? You're really sorry about them. Like you just figured it out. Like, and you're so uncomfortable. It's like, welcome to our world. Like it's actually very revealing about people that they're suddenly like, what do you mean? I thought you've been working with us for 15 years. Like now you're suddenly sorry, but I thought, how come you weren't sorry? And it's just like, it's good and bad. It's a good thing that they're uncomfortable, but it's like interesting to see how quickly they just want to resolve it. Like, tell me what I'm supposed to do. And it's like, what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to go to a deeper level to reflect on the space that you're in, right? And to do it in partnership with Indigenous people and genuine allyship. But they're so overwrought with their discomfort that we like to send you our prayers. And like, could you please stop sending those? Okay. Turn it inward to create the moment, right? Because we're not at the moment.
No. Jordan?
That's fantastic. I think it really gave me a little bit of a good push to take just this first comment and moment. Acknowledging this is our, we live and breathe this, we're born into this environment, this daily struggle, which you know, I might go camping or not. You mentioned COVID, that's just the perfect example for this year of having so many things restricted down and being reminded of what we do have, the blessings we have, but also if we can't stay within our walls with our own family, there are things to figure out there. So I'd like to take a big step, you know, a macro step, if you will, when you think of this word of reconciliation. And from my work with, particularly with Northern First Nations youth who, again, come into the city, 24/7 access to them, living with them, engaging with them at all hours of the night type of thing when I was working at this particular school. And trying to figure out means of experience that could just create that wormhole, if you will, just give them a different type of way of experiencing, interacting with these stories, this narrative, their futures. So there could be some compare and contrast when they go back to their reserve or come back to the city, graduate, now what's next? It's just something that they could have with them to play around with. And one of those things in regards to reconciliation, when we talk about unity, in our language, it's mitakuye oyasin, it's the all my relations. So it is this meta view of the unity of all peoples. The medicine wheel with its colors, there was always reserved space for those that we hadn't met yet, but we knew they were coming. It couldn't only just be us. Any number of vision or implication, especially in the diversity of creation, that there would be more than just us brown folks over here. So when people started coming, there was this anticipation. This kind of macro view, if you will, when it comes to reconciliation for me is, I know that this is, I don't want to pull in the political historical narrative of Christopher Columbus, but I do like the scientific approach that Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is that kind of popular physicist, talked about, and just acknowledging that event of whether it was Chris or Alan or Mary or whoever did that first sailing. His interpretation was that the most significant event ever in our history is because it reunited the two branches of humanity that had split off. This kind of comes back to some particular, anthropological or scientific historical narrative of the Bering Land Strait, etc. There's some, again, contention around that. For me, I'm interested in this idea, as much as science can show it there or not, that there was this story of reunification, the East and the West. And that once that happened, and it took so much time then for things to play out, late 1960s, when the first images of our planet came about, the first time we see the planet as one. Many other examples that continue to facilitate our even ability, and as Roshan mentioned earlier, of a prerequisite for unity or world justice being that identify all the lines or the country states certain things that had to happen before we could begin to access and play with ideas of oneness, of what it would actually mean to see ourselves as one species. Well, to me, I see so many of these examples have happened quite rapidly, quite violently, perhaps, right under our noses, if you will. And in the midst of dealing with that, yes, the more eager, the more, hungry or greedy might have been at the forefront, and set things up in this circle. If you can imagine a circle that is drawn, where my response is, we're at a point now where the circle has been completed. We have completed so many, to the point where we got people trying to leave the planet, as you know, for a tourist ride.
Which ones?
And now we are backtracking over this circle. And in my opinion, there is so much to deconstruct of what has been happening, socially, that by the very nature of taking down any number of patriarchal political law point of view, I mean, my gosh, this Olympics for women to have to make a statement of wearing a full body leotard, for people to get it, that it is over sexualized. And why are we even having to, a team being fined for wanting to wear, oh man, it's so, for wanting to cover themselves more. And we can't just snap the fingers and say, it's not even a question, go right ahead. As opposed to holding to the rule, we can literally have 10 centimeters or something to cover the bottom half of your body as a rule there. Man, removing things like that, I think just leapfrogs certain elements of reconciliation socially. But as we backtrack across what needs to be corrected and taken away, I also would suggest, because this isn't, there's a lot of questions in the chat, whether it's a Baha'i community, as I am hopefully a devout member, I follow this faith for what it presents as an opportunity to look at story of humanity and where we're going, and relationship to our creator in such a way that does present a full circle. Nothing is left out. Nobody is left out. But what we have to now remove and pull the threads back is what humanity has woven over in its own misunderstandings and its own ambitions. And we cannot, as Indigenous people, not include ourselves in that, in our exploration of what could then be rediscovered or invented in our ability to engage with the 21st century, as it will. Having young people to a point where we are traveling around the globe and providing a type of service that other places sought in this land. They didn't necessarily, I love that, yeah, right. I remember that quote from Vine around, somehow they got the land now and we have the Bibles. Well, we still have something that perhaps is not out there in the world that we need to get it. We need to get out there somehow, but it would mean finding those avenues of travel and discourse, a different type of migration that may not be just, again, running away from a fire or persecution, but needing to run out into the world in a measure of healing and a measure of restoration of this story of alignment with our creator, our land, and indeed with one another. So it is exciting to think of what could come. And I've traveled a little bit, and anytime I've seen a young person kind of break out of that prison of self, if you will, where it's not by their own fault, and a lot of the times, but to realize there's a connection that they may have more of an avenue to leapfrog into, so because of their cultural background and all the reasons not to accept the current, as Mary Ellen was saying, like, I'm going to sell you reconciliation. Man, you can smell that a mile away. I really don't want that. There's something else over there that I really want, and that's really exciting to me. So. Thank you.
So on that, for our last few minutes, I mean, let's go where you left off, Jordan, which is the question of what advice does one have for what the Baha'i community can do to support this work, both as individuals and collectively. And I'll just say that following the themes that we've had and the discussion that we've had today, it requires, of course, being truthful about our own community and our own reality and our own history. Of course, the Baha'i community doesn't have the history of the Catholic Church or so forth on these matters, but we do have a very interesting history in relation to Indigenous peoples in Canada, for example. Some of it is quite remarkable. You know, there was a period in time where the most prominent Baha'i in the world was a Canadian woman, and she decided to spend over a decade traveling to every Indigenous community in the Americas that she could go to, and that's what she did. And when she went and visited them, this is Amatul Baha Ruhiya Khanum, or Mary Maxwell, as her Canadian name is, her English name. She always began by acknowledgement of their lands and customs and traditions and apologized for what her ancestors, this is in the 1960s,
Wow.
for what her ancestors had done. And there was a period of time in the 60s, 70s, and 80s where a very large percentage of the Canadian Baha'i community was Indigenous, estimates 30, 40, even 50%. But that is not the case any longer. And there is a lot of reality of hurt and marginalization and change in the participation in many parts of the country of Indigenous peoples in the Baha'i community. Why that is all sorts of things we could talk about. But this is all part of being truthful about the reality of the Baha'i community itself. And faced with this, again, we can't act in a proper way without being honest and truthful about our own history, our own strengths, and our own weaknesses, like in any aspect of life. But so a community that has a different history than churches, certainly in relation to these issues, also has this elements of its own unique interaction and intersection with Indigenous peoples. And in the context of today, where this is foregrounded, mass graves, genocide, a greater reckoning coming, a need for transforming the true meaning of reconciliation, as we've discussed. What can individuals in a community do?
Yeah,
Mary Ellen, and then Jordan, and then we'll close.
I love the comment, but it's a bit ironic coming from you, Roshan, who has spent the last 20 years, you know, tirelessly being in service to Indigenous people in the most culturally humble manner. And I think that it's supporting not just Roshan and the Roshans, but to be present with Indigenous people in this work in more than just reading a newspaper story or, you know, coming to this webinar, which I think is really miraculous in and of itself to have such a wonderful dialogue. Thinking about how to be present in that means how to be spiritually present with people. Of course, that's about prayers and support, but also how to be really present in the work to demand that there is truth for Indigenous peoples and communities and the survivors, and to ensure that we don't cover up this period and regress back to the dark, very dark times of denial. And as Roshan said, all issues, including these that break through to global attention, come with this pushback, right? This really, you know, the anti-racism even work comes with a stronger racist pushback. And to sit with that, to share that solidarity and to be present is like so significant. And to find the many ways to be present through self-education, through action, engagement, and then of course supporting each other in that regard. And I think it's very, very meaningful because we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Canada. It was very flawed. It was very limited. It didn't really have that sufficient. It was brilliant, don't get me wrong, but it was so hamstrung. So I think the key thing is to reflect on that and to be present. But also, as I say, much gratitude to Roshan, who, you know, and to many people in the Baha'i community who stand in solidarity with Indigenous people who are Indigenous people. As Roshan said, there's space in the Baha'i faith for Indigenous people. And I think that that's quite significant, but it's also can get really stale if you rely on one or two people to do it. And like anything, you can't do cultural loading and rely on one or two Indigenous Baha'i to carry the load for you and say, oh, we've got that down. You know, we got that person here. It's got to be real for you, and it's got to be part of your journey. And we're never going to get that unity that we need to have for justice if it's just an emissary, right? So that is something that's quite important, and it's very welcome. So those are my
That's
thoughts,
wonderful.
but I'm just really grateful for
That's
you,
great.
Roshan. Thank you.
Jordan, do you want to add to that as the last word? We're right at 4:31.
Yes, I'll make it quite brief, because I do think it, on the one hand, there's an element of simplicity to it, which is quite beautiful in the fact that, you know, Creator has provided everything a certain way and in perfect order. And as Ernest Tutusis, who there's a clip of him from a CBC show called Man Alive, maybe that's from the older folks in the room know that old series. I always use that or reference it or play it. And then we talked about how, again, this is a land where man has never disobeyed God. We let him run the business, and all we had to do was live in harmony with nature. Because as he talks about the fire, the land, the water, these are holy teachers, and these are spiritual things. And as long as we live in alignment with those things and not try to dominate them, not try to reconfigure them, then we will be okay. And so from the it seems simple, and yet, as I talked about earlier about backtracking on this circle of progress and development, there are many things that we might seem as we have something new to do or new to discover. We don't know quite what to do. Something has to be created. Well, there's so much that can be taken away that we have already done, that ancestors have already done, that history books have already done. And in fact, there's probably so much that maybe that's where it's too much. I see the truth of it. I'd rather have something novel and smaller that will come and go, because it'll lose its media airtime and it'll lose its public interest. But as Joy DeGruy said in the States, Dr. Joy DeGruy, coming from a Black narrative, from the slave stories, when you pull the covers back, as she says, on this one issue, you pull it back on everybody. So the more that we do this work together, I think there will be elements of within Indigenous culture and the simple sharing circle that will help many others deal with pulling back the history of what has been done and continues to be done. But out of working and being together and staying together, I think that's sometimes the confusion of, you've come here to stay and live, but you've done everything to not maintain a relationship with me. And so I have semblance of you being here, but it doesn't feel like you're here. And that's where Vine talks about not being able, visitors not being able to dig their roots because they're not digging deep enough. So that's why, again, I mentioned from a spiritual standpoint, this invitation of looking at our relationship to our Creator that is a little bit different. And I find that to be very inviting without having to go through a lot of what men predominantly have put forward as how to reach our Creator and how to reach the land. So.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary Ellen, so much. Thank you, Jordan, for such a rich and enlightening and instructive and enjoyable and meaningful dialogue and conversation. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And I'm sure we'll have much more to learn and listen, and most importantly, to do to make this change real. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.